We are up to chapter 2 of Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, 2 out of 12. And as I keep repeating, and I will keep repeating, God willing, in these reviews, the Alter Rebbe, when he wrote the Tanya, wrote it in an extremely organized fashion. That's not just information, it's information that's in a very calculated sequence, as we're going to see, God willing, today. So in chapter 1, what did we learn? We learned essentially one nakuda. There are many details, but we learned essentially one point in the first chapter. The point we learned is that the Baal Shem Tov taught that the heavens and the earth and everything within them are sustained constantly by the word of God. And if God were to stop creating them, were to stop speaking them into existence, they would totally cease to exist. Which means that the creation is really an expression of God. Everything that exists is an expression of God and is totally dependent on God at every moment for its existence. This is what the Baal Shem Tov taught, and this is really the nekuda of Achdus Hashem, that God is not just one God as opposed to two gods, but God is one with the world. Really, there is nothing else that exists independently of God. Everything in the world is really just an expression of God. Everything in the world is united with godliness. And we explained that this is true not just in the fact that things are here, but as we emphasized in Perek Aleph in chapter 1, it also has to do with their chayos. We said there's two words. There's hishavos and chayos. There is the creation, the fact that things exist, and there is their inner life, their inner vitality, in other words, their soul, their essential nature. And the essential nature of everything is an expression of God, and an expression of God specifically in that thing, right? As we said, different letters form different things. The letters Yehira Kia form the heavens, and the letters Aleph Beis Nun form the word Evan, form a stone, right? And each and everything is sustained and created with an inner vitality, and is an expression of God at every moment, and that's really what it is. And if that expression were to depart, the thing would cease to exist. That was basically chapter 1. That was what the Baal Shem Tov taught. Chapter 2, as we're going to see from the very opening line, we open with a bang. And chapter 2 is going to begin exploring what we said in chapter 1, al pi seichel, according to reason. Chapter 1 told us all of this based on a Midrash Tilim, and this is what the sages tell us, this is what the rabbis tell us, this is what the Torah tells us, that the nature of the world is an expression of God. In chapter 2, as we're going to see, the Alter Rebbe takes this idea and he is working to have us actually understand it, not just know it and believe it because the sages say so. We are actually going to learn intellectually these ideas. And we're going to be we did chapter 1 in 2 classes. Chapter 2 is probably going to be 3 or 4 classes, maybe even a little longer, depending on how detailed we want to get. And as you can see, as I said, it's a small copy. In other words, chapter 2 is not very long. In the original, which you have here in the Hebrew, it's a page and a half in the original, in the print of the Tanya. It's quite short in the letters, but it's a mu'at hamachzikes hameruba. It's a small thing which contains a large thing, right? It contains, in the short space, a lot of depth. Chapter 3 is going to be a continuation of the explanation intellectually. In other words, the explanation is going to be in stages. Chapter 2 is really the foundation. Chapter 3 and on, we're going to see, is going to build on chapter 2 in a very logical progression. In other words, if you remember where you start and what the Alter Rebbe is doing, you should be able to remember fairly well without having to just brute memorize it. In other words, it makes sense the way the Alter Rebbe is going to explain this. There's a very orderly way that this idea is explained. Okay? So today, we're going to, God willing, start chapter 2. We're not going to get very far in the Hebrew, but we're going to start a little, and then we're going to try and explain. I have my notes here, if I can read them with God's help. All right. Let me use the Hebrew with English here. All right. We're on page 843, right at the top, chapter 2. Vehine, behold, mikan, from this that we have explained in chapter 1, that the entire world and everything in it, the heavens and the earth and all that they contain, is merely an expression of God, a constant speaking of God. God is expressing himself, and that is what that expression is what becomes the creation. From this idea, chuvas haminim, do we receive an answer to the heretics. This is already very intriguing, because in general, and as I think we've mentioned in one of our classes at some point, which is very broad, go find it somewhere, the Tanya is in general not a polemical work.
What work?
Polemical.
Oh,
the Tanya is not out to convince you of things. Polemical means it's a work, it's written to convince you. It's written to convince you of a certain thing. The Tanya is not written to convince you of anything, as a rule. In other words, the Alter Rebbe is not, as we learn from his introduction, in fact, to both parts of the first two parts of Tanya, from each introduction to each of the parts, the Alter Rebbe is not, as a matter in general, addressing someone who is skeptical of any of the Alter Rebbe's basic premises. In other words, the Alter Rebbe assumes that you are approaching the Tanya with a whole host of premises. That you believe that God exists, you believe that God gave the Torah, you believe that the dictates of the oral Torah are divine as is the written Torah, that you are seeking to have a relationship with God, which is a big conditional, right? The Tanya doesn't help if you're not seeking a relationship with God, right? If you're not seeking at least not at the surface level of the Tanya. I mean, there's always words of Torah will arouse the neshama and all of these things, but that's a separate matter. In other words, at least in what the Alter Rebbe seems to be saying, he is never going to tell you why you should want a relationship with God. Such a thing never comes up in the Tanya. Why you should want a relationship with God. That's the prerequisite to the Tanya, right? The Tanya, as a rule, the Alter Rebbe is giving you information that you already desire, right? Polemical works that are trying to convince you of something, is trying to tell you what you should know or how you should think. The Alter Rebbe in general doesn't care. The Alter Rebbe just says what the truth is. He doesn't care what the person is coming, what their preconceptions are. In general, the Tanya is not a work to convince people. Here, at the beginning of chapter 2, we have something extremely unusual. He says, this is the answer to the minim. A min is a heretic. A form of heretic in Judaism. As we are going to see, and as is generally a principle, you should know. You should know. Some people like to run around calling everyone and their neighbor heretics or people who disagree with the Jewish faith. Generally speaking, this is not the case, because generally speaking, as I'm sure, I think Rabbi Silverman speaks about this on occasion, that to be a heretic to Judaism, you have to be very knowledgeable. It's not that everybody who doesn't believe things that are in the basic beliefs of Judaism is a heretic. To really be a heretic, you have to know a lot. To be a heretic is really a scholarly disagreement. In other words, you have to be knowledgeable enough to know really what it is that you're disagreeing with, which the vast majority of people who disagree with Judaism really would not be considered under halacha as a rule. This is why the famous example of heretics as described in Torah, such as Korach, right, or Acher from the times of the times of the rabbinic period, mentioned in the Gemara and all of these things. These are usually great sages who become heretics as a rule. You don't call heretics the ignoramus on the street who doesn't know anything about Torah is an Am Haaretz. He's not a heretic. It's a different term. He's salt of the earth. He's not an actual disbeliever in Torah. To be a disbeliever, you have to know what the belief is in its detail and then negate it. So the
average person doesn't know that anyway.
Correct. But I'm saying a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing, right? So somebody comes to Judaism and they learn a little bit, and they see that the Rambam says that people who don't believe this is a heretic, or someone who doesn't believe that is a heretic, and they think that means that everyone is a heretic, which is not really true. What the Rambam means is it's an informed decision not to believe, right? In other words, it's not just it's not like a switch that happens to be off. It's you learned everything, and then you decided this part does not agree with me. That's
Heretics, atheists?
No. In fact, the heretics we're speaking here are specifically not atheists. As a rule, you should know, which is also interesting, this is also a tangent, but it's interesting. As a rule, the Torah does not really address atheism as a category. The Torah in general, I think atheism is so what we'd say in Yiddish, so abgefragt, so untenable and so unthinkable that in general it's not even a halachic category. There's other types of, there's people who worship idols, there's heretics, but none of these are atheists as a rule. You know, there is an idea of denying God's existence. We do speak of God's existence. It's the first halacha in the Rambam. But generally speaking, as a halachic category, it's very not clear exactly. Like an apikoros, right, which the term apikoros comes from the Greek, from Epicurus, right, who was the famous hedonist philosopher of ancient Greece, right? So he was an atheist in the Greek sense, right? And the term, that's where the term apikoros comes from. But I'm not sure the nature of that atheism. It's not very clear to me. It may not be that it's really atheism as we conceive of it today. It's very interesting. I'm not an expert, but as far as I can tell, atheism is like a step beyond. It's like most heretics are okay, there is a God, but this part of what Judaism says about God is not true. Which is, in fact, the case that we're talking about here. As we are going to see, these heretics, these minim, to whom the Alter Rebbe is addressing chapter 2, right? Those minim are really us, right? Surprise, really we're the heretics. Why? Because I'm speaking for me and my two souls. That's when I say we. It's the royal we. When we said in chapter 1, we said, V'yadaita hayom v'hashavesa elavavecha. You should know today, and you should take it to heart, this idea of the unity of God in the world. And why did we say we have to say take it to heart? Because the nature, our animal nature, rebels against this idea. Everybody has a little heretic inside that says this is not true, because the animal soul really does not perceive in the world the idea that the world is only an expression of God. It's totally against all of the natural assumptions of the animal soul, which the number one, the primary assumption of the inner animal is I exist. That's where everything begins. I exist, now what's step 2? Right? What we're saying here really goes against the animal nature, the base animal nature that's within each and every person. And as the Alter Rebbe is going to say in a moment, what is the heresy? What is it that they don't believe in? It really comes in 3 stages. But the point is that these 3 stages are really our heart. And like I said before, these 3 stages really apply to our own heart, to our own assumptions. And as I said before, the whole point of chapter 2 is we are taking what is in faith and we are bringing it into understanding. In other words, the first chapter, you could say, was speaking to the godly soul. The first chapter was saying the godly soul, of course, believes it with full faith because the Torah says it and the Midrash Tillim says it and the Baal Shem Tov says it. So obviously the godly soul believes. Chapter 2, we begin to speak to the heretic. We take this idea and we have to explain it intellectually because the intellect is the bridge that allows us to take faith and speak to the animal self. So we are beginning to explain it intellectually. And the nature of the heresy, as we're about to explain, is in 3 stages. Yes?
Heretics are kofir, huh?
The English word covers kofer, min, apikeres.
Because minim is something else than
Yeah,
kofir.
it's all there are gradations, correct. I'm not going into them, but yes, you're right. There's all different words. There's all different types of heretics in the Gemara. It's a whole catalog. It's a whole rogues gallery of
Kata minim is for certain people exactly.
Yeah, there's different, it's not, you're right. It's a specific halachic category. In English, generally all translated broadly as heretic. I'm sure there's better English translations. I don't know them. So that's the general translation. So, non-believer, disbeliever. But what is the nature of this disbelief? It comes in 3 stages. As the Alter Rebbe explains, we've managed to get to the 5th word in the chapter. Shetayim bedimyena ma'kezev. They err, they make the mistake in their false comparison, in their false imagining. Shemedamin Maaseh Hashem. What do? They compare the action of God, Eisa Shemayim Va'aretz, L'maisa enosh v'toch b'leisov, to the actions of man and the scheming of human beings. So this is how we're going to explain it. Their mistake is really coming in 3 steps. The basis of their mistake is to compare God to man. That's the foundation. We're going to see specifically in what way in a moment, that their false comparison of God to man. That's the foundation. But it builds. Once you make the initial mistake, right, it's like getting lost in the woods. You make one wrong turn, then another wrong turn, then another wrong turn. There are 3 stages, 3 wrong turns. The first wrong turn off the path is to have a conception of God that is a human conception, specifically in the way that we are about to explain. That's the first wrong step. The second wrong step off the path is going to be that you think the world proceeds without God's involvement. And the third wrong step off the path is going to be the belief that nature rules the universe and there is no divine intervention or anything supernatural that can alter the course of events. Essentially, this leads you to believe in a sort of, in a deterministic perception of the universe, that there's no such thing as miracles, for example, in a way. Pardon? Correct. Deism. Correct. That's exactly what it is, as we're going to get to in a moment. So the Alter Rebbe is going to say in a moment, after we explained what the false comparison between God and man is, we're going to say that if we can fix this, it uproots the root of the problem. Because the second 2 stages of wrong turns can only happen after the first one. So the Alter Rebbe's reasoning is, if you repair this first mistake of comparing God to man, the other 2 mistakes fall away automatically. There's no room for the second two mistakes. And through understanding this comparison, we're going to understand just what type of heretic we're dealing with here. Questions?
Going back to chapter 1.
Yeah.
And just the whole premise of the 10 utterances is a very humanist, assigning human attributes to Hashem to begin with.
To say that they're utterances.
Yeah.
We mean in a very specific way. We're going to mean where he doesn't leave it at this. He means in a specific way, comparing God to man in a specific way, not generally. He means in a specific fashion, as he's about to explain. Says the Alter Rebbe, last line on page 843. Ki kasher yotze l'tzerif kli, that when a human being goes out and forms a vessel, right? I think that we can pick one thing and be consistent, right? Like a potter making a pot, right? Or I think the example most commonly used is a silversmith making a goblet out of silver, right? Or you could have a sculptor. Anything, a human being makes a vessel, right? You could have a blacksmith, anything, any sort of vessel, a carpenter, it doesn't matter. Pick your example, right? A human, you pick one and have it in your mind and keep it in your mind as we go through this chapter. This is one of the primary examples. A human being goes and he makes a vessel, right? As an artist, as an artisan. Shuv, says the Alter Rebbe, ein hakli tzorich liadei hatzerif. The vessel no longer needs the one who forms it. Right? In other words, you make the object, and now it no longer needs your presence, says the Alter Rebbe. Ki af sheyadav misulakas heimenu, the top of 844, because even when his hands are removed from the object, v'helech le b'shuk, and he goes walking in the market, he steps out, and the vessel is sitting there. Hakli kayem b'tavnisay v'tzalmei mamish. The vessel remains in its structure and in its form exactly. Kasher yotza miyadei hatzerif, exactly as it left the hands of the one who forms it. Right? Kach medamim hasachlim halalu ma'isa shemayim v'aretz. That is how these fools, these heretics, conceive of the creation of heaven and earth.
Who was he talking about? Was there at this time a movement among?
No. He's speaking about a conceptual idea of a heretic, really, if I'm not mistaken. There's no particular group or people he's addressing. Like I said, it's conceptual. Really, the heretics are us, as I said before. In other words, who is this really written for? It's written for each and every person. He's framing it in terms of a response to heretics, because really that's what the chapter is all about. The chapter is about you're taking someone who rebels against this idea that the world is one with godliness, and you're explaining it to them in a way that even they can appreciate, who really this is the animal soul in each and every person. So in other words, it's a framing device, but it's not a trivial framing device. In other words, there is such a thing as a Torah definition of a min, of a heretic, and this fits that definition, as we're going to see in just a moment. So what does the heretic believe, right? This is the next step. The first part of the chapter, in the first few lines, Alter Rebbe says, chapter 1 answers the problem that the heretics have. The second little part of chapter 2. What do the heretics say? The heretics say that the earth is created by God just as a human being creates an artifact, right? Which this is not a rare belief throughout history. As Spencer noted, it's a deist belief that calls God the watchmaker, right? That God creates a watch and then the watch runs on its own. That's exactly what we're talking about, that the heretics believe. There's also the whole modern intelligent design movement sees the world that way as well. That God was merely an intelligence who formed the world, and now the world runs according to he programmed nature, and then the world runs according to its nature, right? And in general, throughout history, there is this tendency. Even in ancient times, you could probably find such beliefs. There is this tendency that there is a God. Here's what the heretic believes: there is a God. God can even create the world, right? There is a God, and God creates the world, right? These are not things that Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah is going to explain to us. These are things which are given. This is the type of heretic he's speaking to. You have a heretic who believes there is a God, and he believes that God creates heaven and earth. In fact, he believes he creates them yesh ma'ayin, something from nothing, ex nihilo, like the Jewish belief. What does he doubt? What doesn't he believe? He doesn't believe that God creates it in a way different than a human being creates an artifact. That's his heresy, right? It's what to us seems like a very small point, right? Some people can't even get to the part where they believe in God, right? His heresy is very specific. As I said before, it's a scholarly disagreement. It's a relatively small point, which the Alter Rebbe is going to show is not small at all. On the contrary, it's everything. If you don't have this point, you lose the whole understanding of what the unity of God means, right? The point is, they think God creates the earth as a vessel, like a human being creates a vessel, when really God creates it differently. We're going to get into this in a lot of detail, so I know you have questions about that. We're going to get into that in so much detail, you're going to cry out, don't give me any more details, please. We're going to get into that very deep, what this means about forming the vessel. We're going to have more on that in a moment. But says the Alter Rebbe, that's the Nakuda, that's the point. They think that God operates like a human artisan creating a vessel. However, halfway through page 844, Tach marei seineim, their eyes have been covered over. Hahevdel hagadol, the great difference, shebein maise enosh v'tach beloisav, between the actions of man and his scheming, his machinations is the translation here, which is a great word. It's actually almost a pun. It's actually almost a wordplay in a way, but whatever. Shehu yesh miyesh. Man creates yesh miyesh, something from something. In other words, this heretic, he claims to believe in creation ex nihilo, in creation yesh ma'ayin, but he thinks, he hasn't thought it through, and he thinks that creating something from nothing is the same as creating something from something. And really, these two things could not be more distant one from the other. They're almost opposites, as we're going to see. Creating something from something, as all human creation is. Anything that a human being creates, any vessel you create, in any tool you make, any house, any structure you build, is something from something. You take materials and you manipulate them to create a new thing out of them. God creates yesh ma'ayin, something from nothing. And the heretic thinks that these two things are comparable. That's his mistake. He doesn't realize that yesh ma'ayin is categorically different, fundamentally different. We're going to see just how different it is, like crazily different, very, very, very different from yesh mi yesh, from creating something from something.
I have a question. How do you look at writing a book or even making software? Is it something out of nothing?
No. It's something from something.
The answer should be no.
No, the answer is no, but the thing is that the some things are more subtle. The some things are more subtle. That's the difference. You're not taking an actual physical object, you're really taking something that's more beruchniut, something that's more spiritual, and building from that. And really, the same thing holds. As you'll remember in the first chapter, we're probably going to touch on this at some point later, probably much later from tonight, like by the time we've forgotten this, that we were talking about this. But as you'll remember in chapter 1, we said that it's not just the earth where this idea applies, but the heavens as well are created yesh ma'ayin. So really, your question is really more on the heavens, so to speak. In other words, there's spiritual entities are also created yesh mi yesh, one from the other. So you take the spiritual entity, which is the thoughts in your mind, right? You have certain ideas about plot and murder mysteries and a character, and right, you have an idea of Hercule Poirot, and you have the idea of the train stuck in the snow, and you put it together and you craft this whole story, right? So you're constructing beruchnius, and it's still yesh mi yesh. You're creating something from something that you already have. But I think that the example, I didn't read this anywhere, so this is my own idea. This is my first own idea of the night. But it's much more visceral. Like it's much easier to understand with the physical, although it also applies to the spiritual. So we're going to use the example of the physical, and as you're going to see, as the chapters progress, we're going to get more and more like abstract and delve into more and more tiny details of this whole thing, and you're going to see that really it applies to the spiritual as well. But good question.
My Hebrew school teacher drummed it into us.
Yeah.
Never to use the word create when it comes to man.
Right.
Man can make, he
Right.
cannot create.
Correct. The famous commentary of the Ramban on the first verse of the Torah, Bereshis bara, the word bara always refers to yesh ma'ayin. Creation, the word bere, the bere elam refers to creating something from nothing. But we're not really going to get into... the Alter Rebbe, again, is not out to demonstrate that the earth has created something from nothing. It's the assumption that this is what you believe. And the Alter Rebbe is saying, if you believe this, you should believe all these other things that he's going to say, as he's going to demonstrate. That's really where the demonstration comes in. That's the proof to the heretic. The proof to the heretic is he's going to say, given that there is a God, and he creates the earth something from nothing, then you must not think about it this way, and he's going to show how that's incorrect. And instead, you're going to think about it this way. And that's the corrective to this heresy, which is the heresy against Achdus Hashem. Right? Remember how I said, this is another just a little point here, but remember there's so much to say, so it's a bit in a jumble, I apologize. But as we said in the first chapter, right, there's a difference between Emunah in Hashem and Achdus Hashem, two different mitzvahs. One is faith in God, and one is the belief that the world is united with God. This heretic is only a heretic in the latter. He has faith in God, he believes in God 100%. There is a God and he does create the world. His heresy is against the idea of Achdus Hashem, the unity of God in the world. Again, you see.
It's a laissez-faire belief.
Yes, he hasn't thought this through. And why laissez-faire, do you say?
Laissez-faire means hands off.
Right, God is hands off, correct. Like a deism very much connected. The belief ascribed to Thoreau and Emerson and all of these founding fathers of the United States that God is the divine watchmaker. This is exactly the heresy that the Alter Rebbe is talking about. God makes the world, and then the world is like a mechanism, is like the machinations of man, which is why it's a pun. The world is like a mechanism that is left to its own devices. And it has now been created. And God can go be walking in the shuk, which I don't know what that would look like, but God is off walking in the shuk, and the earth is continuing along on its merry way without him. That's the heresy. That's the mistake here. And the whole problem is that this is not how yesh ma'ayin works. The idea that God could be off walking in the shuk and the earth running on its own does not make sense if you understand what creation ex nihilo, something from nothing, means. You are applying something from something, logic, yesh mi yesh, logic to a something from nothing, a yesh ma'ayin situation. That is the mistake. What is yesh mi yesh? The Alter Rebbe continues and explains to us, the bottom of page 844. What is yesh mi yesh? The Alter Rebbe explains, what is something from something? Rak shemeshane hatsura v'hatmuna. Creating something from something is to change the form and appearance. I don't know if appearance is the right word. To change the form and the arrangement, maybe, something like that, of something, mitmunas chatikas kesef letmunas kli, from the arrangement of a hunk of silver, into the arrangement of a vessel. Right? In other words, what does it mean for a craftsman, for a silversmith, to take a piece of silver and make it into, say, a kiddush cup, a simple cup? He is really only changing the form of the silver, right? This is an old philosophical concept. Form goes all the way back to Aristotle, Lahavdil. It's in non-Jewish philosophies as well. You have the form of the thing. In other words, you have the shape and the qualities of the thing that distinguish it from other things, right? In other words, you can have a silver plate, and you could have a silver Havdalah candle holder, and you have a silver Kiddush cup. What distinguishes them one from the other is the form. What they share in common is the thing out of which they're made, the matter, the material from which they're made, which is silver. And really what the craftsman does is he really only changes from one form to the other. He takes things that he has, he takes things that exist, and he changes their form. I change it from the form of a piece of silver into so that it should take the form of a cup. And that's what it means for me to create a cup.
Question.
Yes.
Does it change the soul of that thing that he made? Because if it didn't, then, a table and a chair and a piece of, lumber in the house will be the same.
No, it changes the soul. Changes the craftsman changes the soul. The soul is connected to the form. It's a very long discussion, and the truth is that I'm hesitant to do it because most of my conclusions on the matter are personal and not things that I've heard from teachers. But generally speaking, my belief, this is how I understand it, is that the soul of the thing, as we're discussing it, the Dvar Havaya, which gives it life, extends upward from the form. In other words, the form actually in the physical object is the lowest reach, the lowest aspect of the neshama, of the soul of the thing. So when you impart a form, when a human being takes the form of a cup and he places it into silver and he makes the silver into the form of a cup, really that is what has taken place. The soul, the spiritual nature, he hasn't really done, in other words, his action is not purely physical. The transfer, the placing a form, forming something into something new is actually also a spiritual act. You are giving it that nature, you are giving it that soul that God speaks into the world in the form of the word kais. I don't want to get into this anymore. It's a digression, but that's how I see it. So yes, the answer to your question is yes. It's a new. He imparts a soul, new soul.
If you take a piece of silver and you bend it a little bit, it gets a different soul.
That's not how it works. It's not just bending it a little bit. That's part of why I don't want to get into it because we're going to be here for an hour.
It's a great Farbrengen topic.
It's not. That's a fair question. That's a fair question, and there's an answer to the question, and I'm not answering it now.
This is not the issue. I'm sorry.
But it's fine. But that's a fair question. That's a fair question. That's the first question everyone asks the first time they hear this idea, and then you have to explain it. But I don't want to do that. Yeah.
Before you go, can you just summarize the key thoughts you've established with us so far?
With what? Creation something from something is to place to manipulate something that already exists into a new form. That's what creation something from something is.
That's what the deists.
That's what the heretic thinks that God does when he creates the world.
Something from something.
Yes. He would deny it and say something from nothing, but he's thinking about something from nothing in a something from something way.
That's the subtlety.
Yes. And there will be more, but we're going to go slowly. So
You keep using the present tense creates. The heretic thinks when God creates versus the past tense when God created.
either it's not being precise there.
Okay.
Either or. So proceeding forward.
So the heretic thinks he knows that God created something from nothing.
Yes.
But the Alter Rebbe is saying, in point of fact, what he really thinks,
Yes.
getting into the heretic's head,
Yes.
what he really thinks,
Correct.
if you could pin him down,
Yes.
is that he really thinks that he created something from something.
Correct.
Because he's attributing the characteristics of God to the characteristics of man.
Yes, he's comparing them. Exactly. Precisely. So so that's something from something. That's something from something. The Alter Rebbe has defined it. What does it mean to create something from something? To manipulate an already existent thing into a new form, right? Which we can already see, right, is almost a contradiction in terms. That's what makes it, and not a contradiction in terms, I take that back. That's what makes it something from something, right? It seems almost too simple to say, right? You have something that already exists, and you take it and you make it into something else, right? Much more mysterious is what God does, which he takes something that does not exist, whatever that means. And trust me, we will be discussing this at great length. He takes something that does not exist, and he makes it into... So he takes nothing, right? Different way of saying it. Tomato, tomato. He takes nothing. He takes something that does not exist, right? Really, you're more accurate in a way, but I'm not getting into that. Right. Well, we will get into that later, not now. So he takes nothing. He does not take anything, and he makes it exist, right? That's much more. So you can see that's the fundamental difference.
That's the question that people ask: is nothing something?
That's exactly, and not for now. So the top of page 845. The top of page 845. So what is he comparing it to? He's comparing it to. I was using that for a clock, but that's okay. He was creating it to L'maisa Shamayim va'aretz shu yesh ma'ayin. He compares it to the creation of heaven and earth, which is something from nothing. Adkan. That's as far as I want to go in the text tonight. Okay? The rest is going to be me trying to explain to you all my notes. So the general flow is, let's review what we read. The general flow is, from what we read in chapter 1, we can answer the heretics. The heretics make the mistake that they think God creates something, they think God is like a human being. In what sense? That the human being creates something from something, rather than something from nothing, which is really what God does, right? And these two things are fundamentally different.
But you can see why they, like the founding fathers, would get there, because for many people, for many centuries, the thought, at least the people at the very top, said or intimated that the powers were divine.
Yes.
And the only way you could actually confront that type of thinking is if intrinsically man was or is control of his own.
Yes, and was left to his own devices.
So you need to have that breach.
Yes, a fundamental principle of liberalism. I'm not saying. This is also a major tangent, which I will not defend against any questions. I would not say that what we are saying now is contradictory to that conception of man, because it's much more complicated. Man does have a degree of freedom and individuality, even according, I think, to what the Alter Rebbe would say, although I would never put those words in the Alter Rebbe's mouth. But it's more complicated. But I think you're right. I think that is the general gist. In other words, the whole thrust that the Enlightenment thought was moving in at the time that the modern democracy was created was the idea that God, generally speaking, they believe that God exists, but He's not going to save us from the tyrants. We have to save ourselves from the tyrants, and the individual must take hold of his own destiny. Absolutely, that's correct. So it's not a big surprise, as Spencer is saying, that they would think in this way. Right, because they have to because the whole zeitgeist, the whole spirit of the time was to distance God and affirm one's own destiny. Therefore, this idea, this heresy, which is the distancing of God from the world, was the naturally occurring theology of the time. That makes a lot of sense to me. So let me just go through some talking points here. You have to pardon me. I'm going to look at the paper instead of in everyone's beautiful face. You know who you are. Okay. Here's the first point. Here's the first important thing. So I said in the general overview of this chapter before, when I was saying how we transitioned from chapter 1 to chapter 2, that chapter 1 is generally speaking the faith position, speaking to the godly soul. And chapter 2 begins an intellectual understanding which even the inner animal can understand, the so-called heretic, right? That's chapter 2. The question might arise, and this is an important point, which is why I bring it up, which is why I wrote it down to say to you. The question might arise if the entire purpose of the Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, of what we're learning, is to speak to us intellectually, which is really the Alter Rebbe's system, that we should be able to take the ideas of faith and internalize them so that we can create a love of God, which was part of the introduction to the whole second book of the Tanya. That's what we're doing here. We're learning about God's unity with the world so that we can have a love of God which we can create by contemplating these ideas at any time. So we have a love of God that we can create, an inner fire, right, that never goes out because we're able to constantly rekindle it by thinking these ideas and understanding them and going through them. So the question may arise, why even bother with Perek Aleph, right? Or maybe a little less radical, why should this be chapter 2? Maybe this should be chapter 1. And the fact that the Baal Shem Tov ascribes this to Midrash Tilim, a faith thing, should come later. Because really what we're talking about here, what we're really trying to do is understand. In other words, chapter 2, in a sense, seems to really be starting the project of the second part of Tanya in earnest, right? We're not just going to read what the Torah says about it. We're going to have a whole body of thought that we can contemplate and understand in a deep, authentic way, the same way we understand anything else in life, that God is actually near to us and that the world is united with God. So if the whole goal is to appreciate it in this authentic way, why start with chapter 1? Maybe this should be chapter 1, the question is asked. And the answer is given. And really, it's an answer that's consistent throughout the Chabad philosophy, throughout the Alter Rebbe's philosophy, and all of the Rebbes, all of the leaders that came after him, who perpetuated this philosophy. The answer is that even though the goal is an integrated and authentic understanding, the first foundation is always faith. We start with faith, and then we move to understanding. And this is always the order. In other words, don't make it, to put it more colloquially, don't make the mistake of thinking that because Chabad philosophy is called Chachma Bina Das, is called wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, don't make the mistake of thinking that that's really what it's all about, that all we believe in is the greatness of wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. It's called wisdom, understanding, and knowledge because it is in a unique position to take super-rational faith and bring it into intellect. In other words, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, Chabad, explains the battlefield. That's where the work is done in Chabad. We take something which is super rational, we take a God who is bigger than the human mind and human understanding, and we try and understand him in the best way possible in order that the faith should not be separate from us but should be part of us, and the fire that can always be rekindled, as we said in the introduction to Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah. So in other words, if we start with only explaining to the minim first, you may, God forbid, think that what the Alter Rebbe's position is really a purely irrationalist intellectual position, that we're learning philosophy here. And the truth is that is, God forbid to say such a thing. That is not the case at all. Lahavdil, we should separate between what we're learning here and rationalist intellectual philosophy. It's almost the opposite. The philosophy aspect is the tool for internalizing the faith. And that is its purpose here. And that's why chapter 2 is chapter 2, and chapter 1 is chapter 1. And if you look at the actual, there's a good theory has empirical experimental basis, right? So that's the Chabad theory. Faith first, intellect second. And both together is what you need. This was demonstrated experimentally by the 7th Rebbe of Lubavitch, who more than any of the Chabad Rebbeim was dealing with a Jewish populace uneducated in Judaism and even largely antagonistic to Judaism, against Torah. And when the Alter Rebbe went out, he did a revolutionary thing. It was revolutionary to most people, but makes perfect sense in the context of Chabad. Makes perfect sense of someone who sees the order of the first 2 chapters of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah. What did he go and do? He said, I'm going to reconnect you to your Judaism, and how are we going to do that? I'm not going to explain to you why Judaism is correct, why I know there is a God, why I know that the mitzvahs are divine, and these are the details, and the rabbinic tradition is correct, and all of that. That's all good, and that all was eventually done. But what's the first step? The first step is wrap this tefillin, or light this Shabbos candle, right? That is the experimental chapter 1 before chapter 2 of Chabad. In other words...
Which is another way of saying actions speak louder than thought.
Yes, actions transcend thought, which is exactly the idea. That's exactly the idea. That's what this means in the Chabad understanding. That the actions connect a Jew to his soul in a super rational way, in a way that he may not even be aware of and may not even feel, especially at first. But nevertheless, the creation is there. In other words, the Rebbe's whole approach to what one might think would be, that people think of the Rebbe as a great pragmatist. The great pragmatist's approach to bringing Jews back to Judaism was 100% unpragmatic. It was completely based on faith. Go and do mitzvahs. The mitzvahs will arouse the soul. And then later, when they do the mitzvahs, they'll have questions, and you'll know the answer to the questions. You'll explain to them about the rabbinic tradition and the existence of God, etc., etc., etc. But Perek Aleph first, chapter 1 first, faith first, and then chapter 2, speaking to the heretic. Right? This is the order in Chabad. That's the first thing I wrote down to tell you. And in the remaining 6 minutes, we have the bottom half of this page and the back half side of the page. No, we'll do most of it next week, God willing. But let's begin at least. For which interruptions? People would get insulted. Whose question goes towards stoppage time? It doesn't sound like a recipe for peace. In the remaining 6 minutes, I want to talk about creation yesh meyesh. 5 minutes now. I want to talk about the creation yesh meyesh, the creation something from something. Really, we'll continue our discussion next week, and I'll repeat most of this next week at the beginning, God willing, but let's hear it a first time now. Creation, yesh meyesh, is not creation at all, as Barry said. It's not creation. Creation is something from nothing. What are you really doing when you're creating something from something? You take the piece of silver and you make it into a cup, right? Or any project, you could build a house from wood, whatever you want, any human, pardon?
You manipulate it.
Formation.
You're manipulating it. You're transforming it, right? Literally, you're applying a form, transforming, right? You're giving it a new form, right? You're giving it a new, the Hebrew word is tsura, a form. You're giving it a new form. Now, what are you really doing? Because think about it this way, and really what I'm about to tell you now, this is not even Chassidus. This is the ancient, like I said, Lahavdil, Aristotle, all the philosophers deal with this idea. What are you really doing with the form? Because not every material accepts the same form. In other words, we're going to talk, God willing, either next week or the next or the week after, about depending on how long it takes to do my notes next week, whatever. We're going to talk about the splitting of the sea. We're going to talk about Kriyas Yam Suf. Exactly. We're going to talk about the splitting of the sea. Water, you cannot make a cup out of water. It doesn't work that way. Water is a liquid. I'm telling you something I think you know already. Whatever you want. Pick a different thing. Pick air and something else. It doesn't matter. Not everything, make a cup out of fire that holds water, right? Whatever you want. Not every material receives the same forms, right? Water can be made into many things, can be made into a river. You can't make a river out of wood. That doesn't make sense. Water makes a river. Wood or silver makes a cup, right? I'm not telling you anything that's too mind-blowing here. What does this demonstrate? This demonstrates that you are not really applying a form that is external to the thing. You don't have the form of a cup, which can now be equally applied to fire, water, and silver, right? Really, what's taking place here, as any good Aristotelian would tell you, a very old idea, not even necessarily a Jewish one, the reason I'm mentioning that is because it's very good for heretics. It impresses them, and the animal soul, when you tell them that Aristotle thought the same thing, which is that what you're really doing is you're bringing out a potential that's in the thing. You're not giving it a new form. The form is already there in potential. And in fact, this is actually what allows us to say that it's the same thing and not a brand new thing. This is how we know it's not creation yesh ma'ayin, right? In other words, I have a hunk of silver on day 1, and on day 2, I have a cup made out of silver, right? And any normal human being who's using his intellect will say that transformed into B. The piece of silver was transformed into the cup. Right? We don't say that the piece of silver disappeared and now there is a new thing, a cup. We say one was made into the other. How are we able to say that? What's the connection? You have a totally new thing. One's a cup, and the other one was a piece of silver. It has totally different properties. The hunk of silver couldn't hold a liquid. This holds a liquid, totally different thing, right? So how do we know that this ridiculous thing isn't true? That it's a completely new object? Some people were ridiculous and said it was a completely new object. By the way, old machleksim in philosophy, there were positions that said it's a completely new object. There's no consistency. Change is not really possible, or everything is change. All sorts of weird philosophies. But the one that really makes sense with regular human understanding, right? What is actually taking place here is you are bringing out a potential that was within the silver. You're not really adding something brand new to it. You're taking something that was already there and bringing it out. And the silver has the potential to be a plate, and a potential to be a besamim holder, and a candle holder, and a cup. And you take and you melt it down and you make it into this particular thing that it has the potential to be. Something which water or fire does not have a potential to be at all. Right? Which is why you can't make water and fire into these things. Yes? I don't think that's too difficult. Therefore, a human being's capacity is not even really to create the form. It's only to bring out the form. And the material, he can't create at all. right? The silver, the underlying material, right? We can create artificial materials like plastics or whatever, but plastics themselves are made of things, right? In other words, they're not, right, exactly. They're also, plastic is really just a new form of something that was old, right? It's chemistry. You're taking the original, whatever it was, the fossil fuels or the natural, whatever they make the plastic, the oil, whatever they make the plastic out of.
It's just a movement of wind.
So you take the old thing and you make it into the new thing. So you can't create the material it's made of, and even the form that it's in, you're really only bringing out a potential that's already there within the thing. Therefore, this is why when you form an object like a silver cup, you can go walking in the market and the silver cup remains on the table, because the cupness, the form of the cup that is in the silver, is not really something that you give to the cup yourself. It's really something that you bring out of the cup. And once it is brought out, it is perfectly able to exist on its own. In other words, it's piggybacking, the cupness of the cup is piggybacking on the existence of the silver. Again, if you were really adding the form, maybe it wouldn't remain a cup when you walk. Maybe you'd constantly have to be forming it into a cup because you're responsible for adding the form. Really, all you're responsible for is making it into something it has the ability to be already. Really, the cup is already there. All you're doing is taking a potentiality and making it actual. You're taking a concealed ability to be a cup and making it a revealed ability to be a cup. But it's in the silver. The cup is in the silver the entire time. Even before you make it into a cup, the cup is really already there, in the silver in potential. All you're doing is revealing that potential, which is why
It's
He uses
path
the-
to go.
Why?
You take oxygen and you take hydrogen, you make it water. It's not, the oxygen was not made to become water. It's like, you change...
the silver wasn't made to become a cup either.
No, this is different material. Silver and a silver cup are the same material. You take oxygen, you make it to become water. This is something else.
First of all, 2
But
points.
you're not creating anything.
It's just a transformation. You're compounding.
2 points. Number one, obviously, the ability to be water is inherent in hydrogen and oxygen when you put them together, right? The truth is that the silver being the cup is not fully within the silver at all. You have to come and actualize it. In other words, it's not really hunk of silver is able to become cup any more than its hydrogen and oxygen is able to become water. A person has to come and actually, it's really person plus silver equals cup, right? But the point is, where was the cup before the person put it there? It wasn't just in the person, it was also in the silver, right? The same thing with hydrogen and oxygen. The potential to be water, right, also exists among the ingredients. Many things with additional ingredients, right? You could say the same thing about a cake, baking a cake, baking bread. Yeah, there you go. Same thing. So there you go.
Let's talk about ice cream.
Ice cream, same. It's all the same idea.
That's why I use it the splitting of the sea and not the
The silver cup is just the simplest example, but really it holds, I think, over much more complex ones. So all of these forms are there in potential in the original materials. This is beside the fact that I'm not getting into that now. Okay, I have more that I could say to the objection about hydrogen and oxygen, much more, but I'm not going to say, not now. So we're actually over time, but let me just do 2 more minutes here, if you'll allow me. We'll review this all next time, God willing. Before the 6 days of creation, before God creates the universe, before He creates everything, there is no potential for the world to exist at all. Really, this is the underlying difference. The underlying difference between yesh meyesh and yesh ma'ayin. So really, think about it this way. When we say creation, something from something, the something that we are transforming includes within it, in a hidden way, the something we're transforming to. The yesh that we are transforming into a new yesh, the something which we are transforming into something new, right? The original something is really what aspect of it is transformed? The form. But in it already exists the something that comes out of it. As opposed to yesh ma'ayin, what do we mean something? What does something from nothing mean? Right? What does that phrase actually mean? What it actually means is that there was no potential, there was no ability, there was no hidden existence of this thing before, and now the thing exists entirely anew. There was no potential for this thing to be before, and now this thing is here. Right? That's the difference. So the universe, there was no potential for a universe to exist before it was created. And therefore, God's creation is truly new. He's not bringing out a form in something that was already there. He is actually making a truly new thing. He's making new matter, and he's also making a new form that did not exist at all previously, that there was no potential for. And really, this is the underlying difference. We're going to build on this idea next week, God willing. But this is the underlying difference. The underlying difference between yesh me-yesh, something from something, and yesh ma'ayin, something from nothing, is that in the former, when a human being creates something, whatever he has created, and we use the term in a qualified fashion, whatever he has created already existed in potential in what he created it from. When God creates, there was no potential for the thing that is created. And as we will, God willing, see next week, it is this understanding which begins to give you a real sense of what the Alter Rebbe is saying, of just how far the Alter Rebbe is willing to go with the idea that the world really is only an expression of God. What the Alter Rebbe means by that. And next week, God willing, using this idea, we'll start to get into that.